Now, to begin with, there are very few images of this, there's no dramatizations, I've never found a documentary, and even paintings are few and far between. So assume all the images I use have nothing to do with the story and are just approximations. Unless I make it obvious with like a symbol or something. Time for a first from me, a non-exploration related, non-polar related tale of maritime horror. Though in my defense, the ship is called the SS Arctic, and I had previously done a video about the raft of the Medusa, and this features a death raft too. The year is 1854, the ship is the SS Arctic, a paddle steamer making a run from Liverpool to New York. Like the much later Titanic, it's a luxurious passenger liner with all the mod cons of the age. There were roughly 400 people on board, 150 crew and 250 passengers, and it would become one of the most infamous examples of what not to do in the event of a disaster. The Arctic was in heavy fog, a few hours sail to Newfoundland, and was making good time. They were going much faster than Captain James Luce would have liked, given the conditions. But the Arctic was an American liner working for the American Collins Line, and the American government made it policy that their passenger ships would push speed as much as possible to outdo their international competitors. But still, fog or not, it had been plain sailing, until suddenly they noticed they were about to collide with a French ship called the Vesta. Now, convention at the time said ships should pass on the right, but they were at such an angle that they would have collided if they did that, so Luce decided to pass on the left. If Deschênes, captain of the Vesta, had not followed procedure, they would have been fine, but alas, he did the traditional thing and they crashed into each other. The Vesta rammed the Arctic near the bow. The Arctic was going at such a speed that the Vesta was dragged alongside, turning it from a stab into a bit of a gash. 5 feet long. Eventually, the Vesta broke free, though, and was left without its bow and sinking. The front of the Vesta was left impaled in the Arctic. Deschênes ordered evacuation and a lifeboat was quickly filled and lowered. Once the Arctic slowed down and came around, Luce ordered assistance for the Vesta and sent his first officer with some men aboard one of the Arctic's 6 lifeboats. 6 lifeboats, which was nowhere near enough for all 400 people. Now, shortly after the lifeboat was launched, the crew worked out that the Arctic was pierced below the waterline, and because they had no airtight compartments, they had no hope of staying afloat. All they could do was make a mad dash for Newfoundland. So they called the lifeboat back, but it disappeared into the fog, and they couldn't wait for it to return. The Vesta's lifeboat had made it to the Arctic, though, just as they fired up their engines, and it was sucked under the paddle. One man survived, and he was pulled into the Arctic. Now, speed was of the essence, and few things slow a ship down more than being in the middle of sinking. But one of those things is having your paddle wheel filled with pieces of corpses and lifeboat splinters. So they didn't get very far. Before they fell dead in the water, Captain Luce hit an evacuation plan to make best use of his 5 remaining lifeboats. Fill them all and hang them from the ship, and when the ship stops dead and sinks low enough in the water, cut them free simultaneously. Then link them up and basically create a flotilla. You see, they didn't want to launch the lifeboats separately because they were still moving, and 5 boats together had more of a chance than 5 individual boats. The only problem is that some of the crew decided they didn't want to do this plan because it involved saving the passengers first. Because this is one of the worst disasters in history to be part of if you're a passenger. When the first lifeboat was half full of passengers, the crew in charge of it took their chance and cut the ropes, sailing off into the fog, never to be seen again. Only 4 lifeboats were left. The Arctic had come to a stop by now and was dead in the water. Another lifeboat was being filled with passengers when crew grabbed weapons and stormed it. The boat was dropped from the side and most, if not everyone on board, was killed. That lifeboat was recovered and reused later on. Another lifeboat was being filled with crew and passengers when the officer in charge decided to make a run for it. He ordered the ropes cut when it was half full. Almost all crew. They ignored shouted orders to stay in the area and pick up survivors from the water once the ship took its final plunge. This boat sailed off into the fog and reached Newfoundland. 3 lifeboats left. The recovered lifeboat was filled, mostly with passengers, after Captain Luce almost beat a mutinying crewman to death for trying to storm it. Then before launch, other crewmen joined in the mutiny and overfilled the boat. Crew and passengers were sent overboard. The boat was launched, and the crew in the water climbed aboard, leaving the passengers to fend for themselves. The boat then sailed away into the fog, met the last boat, and made it to Newfoundland. 2 lifeboats left. While all this excitement was going on, the chief engineer gathered supplies, his buddies, and as many weapons as he could, and slipped away in another lifeboat. Desperate passengers and crew, already in the water, tried to board this boat as it sailed away and were attacked. The boat was never seen again. One lifeboat left. This lifeboat was launched and set near the Arctic. The idea was to create a raft with a lifeboat at one end, guarded by some loyal crew with guns. They stripped wood from anywhere they could and constructed the raft, being lashed with near-freezing waters up to their necks. But on ship, things were going from bad to worse. You see, exactly no women or children had escaped, and the families on board seemingly gave up, huddling together in prayer. Among them were the families of the Collin Line's owners Edward Collins and the line's president James Brown. And while the crew, loyal to Captain Luce, followed his orders and constructed the raft, the rest of the mutineers decided that if they couldn't take the last lifeboat, they'd at least make their last few minutes happy. They raided the stores and drank heavily, they looted the cabins, and then they attacked the passengers. There were accounts of rape and murder. And finally, they turned their attention to the last lifeboat. They trampled the crew building the raft and set it adrift, half built and falling apart. It ended up being dragged into the paddle, killing yet more people. Many mutinous crew, got into the lifeboat and set it loose. No lifeboats left. All the remaining crew, passengers, and Captain Luce could do was wait for the end. Captain Luce did his best to comfort the families. Children asked him to save them a spot on one of the boats, not realizing that the Arctic was the only boat left. They had 4 hand pumps on board, and manning it was painful, strenuous work. It took experienced stokers 15 minutes until their hands were blistered and they were exhausted. One of the 2 stewardesses on board, Anna Downer, was found long past the point the pumps were useless. Her hands were bloody and she said that she'd keep pumping as long as her arms worked. She was black, and a paper run by Frederick Douglass campaigned for a monument to be built to her. It was never made. Also staying at his post to the end was teenager Stuart Holland, one of the junior sailors. He was manning the only piece of long-distance communication they had, a cannon. He apparently said that if Captain Luce should reach land, then he should let the world know that there's one man who did his duty bravely. You were a real one, Stuart Holland. He fired and refilled and fired as often as he could until the deck sank from under him, and a wave of debris and corpses sent him into the ocean. There was also an effort to have a monument built to him, and it was never made. Luce apologized to the family of his employers for the conduct of his crew and went to his cabin. His son Willie was there, waiting for news. His son was 11 and sickly. He joined his dad on the voyage so they could spend some time together, because as a ship captain he was rarely home. Luce carried his son up to the deck, and they waited together for the end near the bridge, and went down together. Apparently, the sound of the cold sea meeting the warm boilers made a loud noise, which sounded like the ocean groaning in pain as the ship sank. The Luces held on to each other in the water, but the paddle box, which holds the wheel on the side of the ship, came loose after the ship sank and violently returned to the surface, erupting out of the water and landing on several people, including Willie, killing him instantly. It was turned upside down, and 12 people, including Captain Luce, made it into a makeshift boat, holding on to each other like a conga line to keep it from overbalancing. The disintegrating, half-made raft became home to many survivors, including the Brown and Collins family. For a while. It continued to fall apart, the weather got worse, and the survivors in the water scrambled for anything they could hold on to, attacking each other and the victorious being sent flying by violent waves. Eventually, blood from open wounds attracted sharks. By the time rescue came, there was only 1 person left in what remained of the raft, and 3 in the paddle box, including Captain Luce. 3 lifeboats from the Arctic survived. The 2 that met each other in the fog and made it to Newfoundland, and the other was the final lifeboat. Somehow, once again under the command of Dorian, the officer that had defended it from the mutineers. Dorian's ship was saved by a Cunard liner. Cunard were one of Collins's international rivals, the reason for the government's insistence on speed. And ironically, the rescue ship's captain had previously been saved from a shipwreck by a Collins liner, the Arctic sister ship, the Pacific, which also had a sticky end. Anyway, based on information from Dorian, the same liner eventually found the wreck and saved other remaining survivors. When the ship made landfall in Canada before heading on to New York, they found that Luce was already being vilified in the press. You see, the Vesta had survived the crash. They knew nothing about the extent of the damage to the Arctic, and the original lifeboats sent to help them never reached them. They saw the Arctic speed off, leaving them to die, and assumed it was malicious negligence. And then, without the front chunk of their ship, they managed to limp into port and told the press what had happened. The men from the lifeboats who made it to Newfoundland joined in the attacks on Lewis, claiming that it was his fault they mutinied because he should have been saving them instead of passengers. As for what happened later, the US government continued to insist on speed. Captain Lewis refused to return to the sea. Some crew refused to leave Canada and return to the USA for fear they'd be arrested. But there was no inquiry and there were no arrests. Calls to make it the law that there had to be enough lifeboats on board were ignored. And Cunard, seeking a chance to grasp scumbaggery from the jaws of heroism, had a parade a couple of weeks later in New York to celebrate their ship's safety record. That might just be a coincidence, but they still didn't postpone it. There were some notable people on board the Arctic. The French ambassador to the USA, the Duc de Gramont, survived. He leapt from the ship and climbed into the last lifeboat after it broke free of the raft. Frederick Catherwood was an English painter and explorer who travelled through South America and did renderings of newly discovered ruins. He was among the lost, but for reasons that I've never been able to work out, his name was left off the official casualty list, until his famous friends kicked up an almighty stank, and the New York Herald Tribune made the following correction. Mr. Catherwood is also missing! There were about 400 people in the Arctic, about 250 passengers and 150 crew. 85 people survived, 61 crew and 24 passengers. No women or children. Women and children first was a concept by this point. It was kind of a chivalric British thing that was bandied around more than actually done, but this disaster made it more of an actual thing. It never became law, but it became the norm. Kinda. The Collins line never recovered from the disaster, and it closed in 1858. Edward Collins, the owner who lost his wife and child, changed careers and remarried. The Collins line president, James Brown, who lost 6 of his family in the Arctic, built a memorial to them in New York. It's the only memorial to the loss of the ship. And that was the tale of the SS Arctic. Far from the worst death toll in maritime history, but hard to beat for sheer long-term scumbaggery. If you want to know more about the Arctic, then I suggest checking out The Terrible Disaster of the SS Arctic from Part-Time Explorer on YouTube. Link down below. Or if you want a book, then check out The Sea Shall Embrace Them by David Shaw. Both are excellent. If you want me to branch out a little more and cover more shipwrecks and stuff, please let me know.